Before the start of round 7 in Norway chess, Sergei Karjakin was leading with 4.5 points, and he faced Hikaru Nakamura, who was on 3.5. And as ever, Nakamura was out for the win, and he played a really sharp opening variation. And after 23 moves, they reached this position. So Nakamura with black. Now you can see his pawns on the king side could be better. They've advanced in front of the king, actually rather weak. I mean, they're defended for the moment, but in the long run, could be a liability. On the other hand, he has managed to shatter the pawns here on the queen side. Now, white has just played rook takes d6, threatening the knight on e5. And Nakamura saw his chance. He thought he could play the knight in. Obviously, there's a pin here that can't be taken. Gaining time on the queen, and then he wants to get the knight into this very dangerous square on c4. So really double-edged position. Karjakin played an excellent move now, queen to h1. So now the knight is threatened, but also the pawn here. So Hikaru carried out his plan of knight c4. Of course, that hits the rook, so the rook, well, at some moment it's going to have to move back soon. And also, the queen threatens the pawn here. But, of course, this had all been planned. e5 shuts out the queen, and that's a really nice pawn chain now. You can see these pawns on the king side are very powerful, very strong chain compared to black's pawns that lack protection. So the queen had to come back, and now rook d4. So the h-pawn is threatened, so Nakamura played h5. And now an excellent move from Karjakin. At this moment he really started to take control. Queen e4 threatens the knight on c4, and black doesn't have time to try to maneuver the queen round here because, of course, well, apart from the knight being on prise, but g6 is threatened as well. So, I mean, queen e4 is a beautiful centralization. So b5 protects the knight, and now a simple move, rook d1, gaining control over the d file. And black is in big trouble here. Probably the best is to try to run into an endgame, but even here, I think, because of these weak pawns, and of course the 7th rank is looking pretty bad for the king, white has a big advantage. But Nakamura played rook c7, which looks sensible to prevent the rook coming here, but they're now a superb move from Karjakin. Obviously prepared in advance. He played this really quickly, beautiful move. Let's see what happens if black just plays, well, a nothing move. Let's say a5. Well, the threat is to play rook d7. Now you can play rook takes, but maybe knight takes is the best move, followed by knight f6 check and rook d7, and it's all over. And if knight b6, preventing a rook coming in here, then this is a very nice winning move, and rook d6, and you can see how weak black is here, and the knight is also threatened. White just wins. So Nakamura took the knight, but this allows the rook in to d7. And here, if the queen retreats, then queen b7, threatening rook g7 and rook h7, followed by queen g7 is going to be mate. And rook f7 loses to takes a check on the back rank, and we win the queen. So in this position, after rook d7, Nakamura just gave up his queen. So black has a rook and a knight for the queen, but his position, in particular his pawn structure and the position of his king, are so bad that there is no chance of constructing some kind of fortress here. Black is utterly lost, and Karjakin played g4, opened up the king side, and although it took some time to win, the result was never in doubt. So this happened pretty early on in the session. Now, you might remember that Carlsen was just a half a point behind Karjakin. He's chasing. So the question was, could he keep the pressure on and win his game. Carlsen had black against John Ludwig Hammer, of course the weakest player in the tournament, so Carlsen was very keen to try and target him and go for a win here. Now we join the game after 26 moves, and it's a pretty even position. Carlsen has been struggling since the opening to try and create complications, but Hammer's played very solidly indeed. And meanwhile, Carlsen was using up so much time, and he was down to his final few minutes here. But here, Hammer played incorrectly. If he plays something like knight f5, then, well, you can see that the g7 pawn is threatened. If pawn takes knight, then rook takes, and suddenly white is doing very well. But black can save himself with knight f6, and that's actually a very solid move. White exchanges, well, maybe plays the rook in. I think this endgame is going to end up as a draw, for example, here. Both sides take pawns. Should be a draw. But instead, Hammer played knight b5, and I think this was a bad move. I think he misjudged the resulting position. Carlsen took, and now played knight f6, and suddenly the position has changed. This knight does a brilliant job of protecting the king. It controls d7. If necessary, sometimes it can come back to d5. And if the queens are exchanged here, then, well, you can see this bishop is very poor indeed. And importantly, this king is a long way from the center of the board, so black's rook can come in very easily, and the king is in big trouble, as well as the pawn here. So Hammer played queen d6 check. Now, if the queens are exchanged here, it's possible, but you can see white's rook would be very active, and it's not so clear. For instance, here. And there's some pressure on b6. So Carlsen played a very brave move, king e8. Remember, he's running really short of time now, just a couple of minutes, while Hammer had something like 15 minutes remaining. But white can't exploit the position of the king. There's no way through for white. Be a different story if the bishop were on g2 ready to come in here, but it's too slow. So Hammer played queen d3, avoiding a queen exchange. Now an excellent move from Carlsen, queen d5, and this actually forces a queen exchange, because I know it looks strange to put the queen here, sort of in front of the rook, but if queen b1, then black can simply take this pawn off, and there's no way for white to generate any kind of attack in that position. So Hammer exchanged queens. Now I was expecting knight takes, keeping an even structure, but Carlsen played pawn takes queen, and the point of this is just to shut the rook out completely. Of course, if knight takes, then you'd still have to take care of moves like e4, and maybe the rook can come in. I still think black is doing pretty well there, but e takes d5 is an attempt to shut out the rook, and then black controls the open file. Maybe rook c2, maybe rook c5 to take this pawn. And here, Hammer had something like 10 minutes remaining. Carlsen had about a minute and a half. So Hammer went in for a bit of a think here. He realized that if he started to play passively, say rook d2 to guard the second rank, then black has all the trumps in this position. His knight is very active, can possibly come into e4. The rook is very active. The king can come up the board. This is very important. So you can activate the rook, use your king to protect the pawn, then move the knight in, and well, you can actually use the king very actively on the queen side as well, possibly coming in to try to get to this pawn. So Hammer realized that if he remained passive, then he would have problems. Look at the difference between the kings. The king on g2, well, it should be over here somewhere, trying to protect some squares, but Yeah, on g2, it's too far from the action, it's too slow. So Hammer had a think here, and I think from a practical viewpoint, he probably made a good move. He tried to complicate. He played this extraordinary move, e4, and this really stirs up the position. Well, firstly, if knight e4, then rook d5, and white should be okay there. If pawn takes pawn, that's more interesting, but then the idea is to play rook d6, hitting the b6 pawn. Hang on, let me get my mouse, there we go. Hitting b6, and if black goes passive, then bishop g2, and well, it's very hard for black to free himself here. I mean, now the king can just march into the middle and try to pick up pawns. I mean, maybe knight d7 is possible here, but you know, you've got to calculate all kinds of things like bishop h3, and you know, this is very hard when you're down to your final seconds to try to gauge this position. Really difficult to calculate. So I think Hammer made a very interesting decision to play e4, and Carlsen played very practically. He just activated his rook. And now maybe the best is to play pawn takes pawn, but okay, it's difficult to appreciate. And play d6 and maybe try and activate your rook like this. And you can see the bishop guards the pawn, but you know, you have to watch out for the a pawn here. I mean, this is a very double-edged position. But sometimes there's moves like bishop h3 as well, threatening something nasty down there with a rook. But that's probably the way for white to play. But I mean, it's really hard to judge that position. Hammer pushed on with e5, which looks very dangerous. The knight came in. He took on d5. Now, good decision from Carlsen. Instead of taking on f2, which is something of a distraction actually, he took on b2. And this is much more to the point because he wants to make sure that he's got this passed a pawn steaming down the board. And now the knight controls d6, so it's not possible for the rook to get counterplay for the time being. So rook d4, so the idea is to push the knight out of the way. If knight takes f2, then you know, you can come in with rook d6. There are a couple of very tempting moves here, and maybe if Carlsen had more time, he might have been able to work out whether knight c3 or knight c5 was strong. But it's really difficult to work out when you just have a few seconds left whether the a pawn is going to be strong enough or whether white gets decent counterplay with rook takes pawn and rook a6 and so on. So Carlsen instead played a very good move. He just kept control. He played rook b4, so didn't have to move the knight. And of course, rook takes rook, pawn takes rook. Well, this pawn will run home with the help of the knight coming to d2. So the rook had to go back. So white hasn't been able to find counterplay by attacking the b pawn. And now time to push the a pawn. And here, knight c3. This is very different. If the rook comes to d6 now, you can see that black is a couple of moves ahead with the a pawn, and this is winning very simply indeed here. And there's, well, rook a4, rook check, and a1 was also winning. Now white is lost. Hammer tried bishop c6, but the king advanced. The rook came behind the pawn, but after king e5, they'd reached the time control. Hammer had time to survey his position, and here he realised he was completely lost and resigned. This a pawn is simply too strong. If rook takes pawn, then the pawn just goes through, supported by rook and knight. The rook can come here. If king g2, well, you can just move your king in, and the threat is to play something like this, or via d3 and c2, just to get to b2 and push the pawn. And if bishop e8, well, you can play here. If the bishop comes to this diagonal, try to stop the pawn. Remember, you can just play rook takes pawn, and that's two pawns. And there's also rook a5, and it's all over. So again, wonderful technique from Carlsen, played very practically indeed. Well, at least when he was very short of time, but he came very close to messing up. So after 7 rounds, Karjakin is still in the lead with 5.5. Carlsen is still just behind him with 5, and then there's a gap. Aronian on 4, Anand on 4. Anand won a beautiful game today, I should mention, actually. Thanks for watching.